The Biotechnology Innovation Organization is engaging President Donald Trump in the hope of protecting and improving FDA. It's also hoping that biotechs and pharmas can dodge tariffs, and it wants to find paths to modify the Inflation Reduction Act and reinstate pediatric priority review vouchers. We'll have key takeaways from Washington editor Steve Usdin's conversation with Bio's CEO, John Crowley. We'll also discuss how autoimmune CAR T companies are competing for resources and take a close look at Telix's end-to-end Radiopharma ambitions. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me today on the BioCentury This Week podcast are my colleagues
Steve Usdin, Washington editor.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Karen Tkach-Tesman, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Excellent. Thanks for joining me, guys. Hey, join BioCentury and investment bank Oppenheimer next week on Tuesday, March 25th for a capital markets preview webinar called The Economy, Policy, and the Path Forward for Biotech. We have a great lineup of speakers, including Michael Margolis from Oppenheimer, Chris Barden from MPM, Christoph Broha of EQT, Brett Zabar of General Atlantic, and it will be moderated by my fellow BioCentury This Week podcast host, Stephen Hansen. It's free to register. Listen live at 11 a.m. Eastern on March 25th. You can ask questions, register to receive access to the recording. BioCenturyWebinars.com. Okay, let's head to Washington. Steve, you had the chance to sit down with John Crowley on the one-year anniversary of the former Amicus CEO taking the top job at BIO, the Biotech Trade Association. What did you learn?
Well, there's a lot. You highlighted one of the interesting things that he talked about, which was he kind of lifted the curtain a little bit on a frenetic campaign that he and others have been engaged in behind the scenes to try to prevent massive cuts from eroding FDA's ability to review drugs. There were plans at DOJ and from Secretary Kennedy, HHS Secretary Kennedy, to fire the agency's center directors, to slash review staff. Interestingly, Crowley publicly supported Peter Marks, director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research. He told me the threats to fire him were serious enough, and Bio's interest in keeping him in place were strong enough that he felt he had to make a public plea to keep Marks on the job. And FDA's Center for Biologics and their Center for Drugs, at least the review staff, have been largely spared from the cuts at FDA so far. Concerns about FDA remain. FDA and other federal agencies were required to submit initial plans to the White House by last Friday for large-scale layoffs, what are called reductions in force or RIFs in the government. And today was the first day of a back-to-office mandate at FDA that's likely to drive a lot of FDA employees to leave if it isn't modified. So there are those challenges. We talked about that. We talked about international reference pricing, what President Trump calls most favored nation. And John Crowley said that's a real threat. It's top of the mind for President Trump that Americans pay more for medicines than people in Europe and other countries, and he wants to change that. A couple of other things really that struck me. We talked about Biosecure a little bit. Remember, that was the law that was pending in Congress all of last year that was supposed to really decouple the U.S. biotech and pharmaceutical industry from contract manufacturers and genomics companies in China, and Chinese companies are operating in the United States. It didn't pass at the end of last year, and John Crowley said that he doesn't think it's going to pass this year. He doesn't think it's likely to happen at all. I think that's
Steve, let me jump in there. I'm curious. Competition with China is sort of always on the mind of lawmakers. I know it's on the mind of the Trump administration. Is something going to replace Biosecure or come up in its place?
So I think there's two sets of answers to that, okay? One part of it is what are the things that the Trump administration and or Congress might do to limit the ability of Chinese companies to invest in the United States, U.S. companies to invest in China, or to limit dependence on Chinese companies. I think that there are going to be things that are going to happen. I think there are going to be things like enhancing CFIUS review of Chinese investments in the United States. And there are going to be moves that the Trump administration is going to put in place to try to discourage U.S. companies and U.S. investors from investing in or collaborating with companies in China. But the specifics of the Biosecure Act, I think that's not going to happen. I think that specific restrictions on U.S. companies using Chinese contract manufacturers, for example, doesn't seem to be in the cards. The other thing, the thing that I talked with John Crowley about, is the idea that there still remains a tremendous amount of concern about U.S. reliance on China, on India, on other countries for pharmaceuticals. And what Bio is trying to do, what others in Congress are trying to do, is to use this concern to leverage support for incentives that will make it easier and more economically attractive to do manufacturing and to do the kinds of services that Chinese CDMOs like WuXi, Aptec, and WuXi Biologics do, to make it more attractive for U.S. companies to do manufacturing and contract development in the United States.
Reference pricing, that's come up a lot in the past. Does it have legs?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. What Crowley said basically said that that's something that President Trump is top of his mind. It's not going away. There's some talk that I've heard among pharma CEOs of some kind of a deal, some kind of a bargain that they can make with Trump to persuade him to not impose an international pricing regime, reference pricing regime on the United States. But it's really unclear what that would look like. But it's something that's definitely got a lot of people's attention.
And the pediatric PRVs, what's the plan there? Is it going to be in standalone legislation? Is it going to be tucked into must-pass legislation? What's the outlook there?
Look, there's not going to be very much standalone legislation on anything in this Congress. I think if it's going to happen, it's going to have to be put in some kind of must-pass legislation. One possibility is the big tax bill that's coming up. But I think, it's interesting because there is very strong bipartisan support for pediatric priority review vouchers. And there was a lot of disappointment that reauthorization of that program didn't get included in the continuing resolution. That's the budget bill that was passed last week that keeps the government going through September 30th.
Tariffs and the IRA, those are two of the big other things you talked with him about. Let's start with tariffs. What are you hearing?
There's just an enormous amount of uncertainty. There's uncertainty about whether the tariffs on pharmaceuticals are really going to happen. President Trump has said that he's going to impose tariffs on pharmaceuticals. What does that mean? Is it just finished products, or will it also be APIs? Will products that are in shortage or could become shortages could develop as a result of the tariffs, will they be exempted? It's all completely unclear. And, what the biotech industry and the pharmaceutical industry are lobbying for is broad exemptions from tariffs. There's also a school of thought that World Trade Organization rules that the United States has signed on to prohibit tariffs on pharmaceuticals, but that probably wouldn't stop the Trump administration from imposing them if that's what it wants to do. One of the real problems with the tariffs is that there's a complete mismatch in timing. There's a dissonance. Tariffs, of course, would go into effect immediately. In theory, they're supposed to create incentives for domestic manufacturing, but domestic manufacturing will take years and massive investments to come online. And that kind of disconnect is a real concern for the pharmaceutical industry and also for the generic pharmaceutical industry.
And how about the IRA? What's going on with the pill penalty?
So John Crowley said that it remains a top priority for Bio to fix the so-called pill penalty. He believes that there's bipartisan support for doing that in Congress, but we didn't really talk about the specifics of how that might happen. I know that there are going to be hearings. The Energy and Commerce Committee is going to have hearings on the topic pretty soon, and that will probably raise attention. In addition to the pill penalty, there's also hope that the exemption for a single orphan indication will be expanded so that it doesn't create disincentives for companies to develop more than one orphan indication of a drug.
All right, let's turn to CDC now. David Weldon joins Matt Gaetz as one of the very few Trump picks to have his nomination withdrawn. What went on here?
So he learned, David Weldon's a former member of Congress and a physician. He learned the night before his confirmation hearing last week that the White House had withdrawn his nomination to head the CDC because Republican Senators Bill Cassidy and Susan Collins were going to oppose him. Apparently, they didn't think that putting an anti-vaxxer in charge of CDC in the midst of a measles outbreak was a great idea. Weldon didn't take the news very well. He issued a 4-page, to be honest, semi-coherent complaint about it. He said that he isn't anti-vaccine, but then he devoted a whole page to praising debunked claims that vaccines cause a variety of childhood diseases. He said that if he had been made the head of CDC, he planned to, quote, quietly, quote, investigate the databases to try to find evidence about links between vaccines and autism. I think that anyone who reads those 4 pages will come to the conclusion that the country dodged a bullet by having his name withdrawn from that position.
Excellent. Who are they putting up in his stead? Has that been?
There haven't been any announcements, and there haven't even really been any credible rumors.
And Dr. Oz, when I last checked, he was getting savaged in Fetterman campaign commercials. He's up for CMS?
He is, and he's widely expected to be confirmed as the head of CMS. The other things that happened last week is that the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee voted largely along party lines to endorse the nominations of Marty Makary as FDA commissioner and Jay Bhattacharya as NIH director. There was a little drama around the Makary vote. Republican Senator Josh Hawley had threatened to oppose him because he said that Makary had been responsible for the appointment of Hillary Perkins as chief counsel at FDA. As a career attorney at the Department of Justice during the Biden administration, Perkins had defended FDA's regulatory decisions about the abortion drug mifepristone in several court cases. Hawley and other abortion opponents said this made her unacceptable as FDA's top lawyer, and Hawley said the fact that Makary had supported her made him wonder or doubt whether Makary was suitable to be the FDA commissioner. She resigned the day before the committee vote after being on the job all of 2 days. This paved the way for Hawley and all of the Republicans, plus 2 Democrats on the committee, to vote in favor of Makary. And now it's up to the full Senate. They're almost certain to confirm him as commissioner and Jay Bhattacharya as the director of NIH.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Steve. We are going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back and talk about CAR Ts.
BioCentury This Week is supported by the BioCentury Conference Series. For 3 decades, BioCentury has helped biopharma executives and investors make business-critical decisions and build larger networks with peers across the biopharma innovation ecosystem. Our goals are simple: gather the right people in the room to partner, network, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. BioCentury's upcoming events span the globe and feature topics from translation to company building to deal-making and investment. We hope to see you on the road at an upcoming BioCentury event. Visit biocenturyontheroad.com for more information and to register.
We are back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. I'd like to bring Lauren into the conversation now. Last week, she wrote that 30-plus companies running CAR T cell trials in autoimmune diseases shows that there's conviction in the modality's potential. But the rush has also sparked some concern about wasted resources, recruitment challenges, and market opportunity. Lauren, welcome to the pod. What did you learn?
So this all stemmed from the fact that there are more than 30 companies running clinical trials, 2.5 years after we first got the convincing evidence that the same CAR T cells that are used to treat B-cell cancers can treat and lead to long-term remissions and, possibly even cures for autoimmune diseases. So These are just the companies in the clinic. I mean, there are tons and tons of companies that are also trying to take their CAR T cell technologies into the clinic. It's still in preclinical development. So every time something like this happens, there's always the question of, is this good for innovation? Is this good for the companies that are participating? Or is this wasted resources? And so something that we've heard at BioCentury a few times now is that recruiting patients, finding trial sites is becoming difficult. Within the CAR T cell space in general, I don't think at this time the sites are necessarily limited, but it's not like you can run one of these trials anywhere. It has to have like the right heme-onc center that's capable of delivering autologous CAR T cell therapies. And you also have to have enough autoimmune disease patients at those sites. And, there has to be enough interaction between these two departments to enroll patients from these hospitals into the trials. There seems to be some competition for sites. There's also the fact that it can be hard to recruit autoimmune disease patients to any trials, but a high-risk CAR T cell trial in particular would present some additional concerns, I think. For one thing, patients need to go off of the therapies that they're on. So a lot of these trials are in lupus patients. A lupus patient going off of their drug that may not be working perfectly, but may be holding them in some form of remission is a flare risk, and that can do long-term damage.
So in CAR T for cancer, there's been a tremendous amount of activity in China. And I think a sense that Chinese companies have a regulatory environment that allows them to move much faster than CAR T companies in the United States. What about an autoimmune?
We're seeing the same thing. So especially the early stage trials, the investigator-initiated trials, there's just a long list of Chinese companies behind these. Some of these companies don't have websites yet, so it seems like companies may even be formed around the concept of taking CAR T cells into autoimmune indications. Something interesting about those is that it's not necessarily just the autologous CD19 CAR Ts that are being tested. It's some of the more innovative things, in vivo CAR Ts or allogeneic CAR Ts. So one of the reasons there's so much competition here is because we already have CD19 autologous CAR T cells that have been used to treat cancer patients. You can use the exact same cells in autoimmune disease patients, and they work. On that initial efficacy, there's not a lot of differentiation. Where the differentiation could ultimately come is on the safety and on the process, how burdensome it is to patients, because the autologous CAR T cell process can be highly toxic, the conditioning and the cells themselves. So right now the question, and I think this is where differentiation may come in the future, is how much can you cut the dose or improve the process or cut down on durability through an allogeneic method, for example. How low can that threshold be in autoimmune applications? And once we get those answers, you might start to see certain cells or companies or technologies emerge on top.
Companies that are operating in a more permissive regulatory environment presumably are going to be able to iterate more quickly and maybe come to those kinds of answers ahead of companies that find it more difficult or time consuming or resource constraint to do those trials, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you can take a cell therapy into an IIT in China very quickly in a couple months, there's a signal finding benefit to that. Less investment, less time. And then you can choose to go from there.
Lauren, I really like the graphic that you made spelling out kind of who's doing what with what target combinations, et cetera. I encourage everyone to check that out. This all raises the question of, is there room for everybody who wants to jump in? How do you think that will play out? I noticed that you were talking about different sort of indications and certain perhaps niche, smaller indications outside of the maybe SLE avenue. Yeah, how do you think this landscape will sort out in terms of where people actually try to compete?
One thing I heard during my interviews is that being first really matters, especially in the autologous CAR T cell space, and specifically being first in an indication. Obviously, a lot of people are going after lupus, but you see a lot of repeat in the types of indications that the companies are exploring beyond that. And I think it's a bit of an unanswered question. We know where the B cell depleting mAbs work or work relatively well, but how driven these indications are by B cells will determine how effective this broad modality will be, especially when the target is CD19. So with some of the more the less prevalent indications, that's kind of an outstanding question that will be answered as more clinical data come in. But I think you'll see the indications where this is most suited will be better defined this year in the coming years. And then I guess in the target space, that's another unanswered question. So CD19 is not the only target. You can deplete B cells at different stages with different molecular targets. There's the BCMA. There's the question of whether depleting CD19 and BCMA together will be better to get a more thorough knockdown. But again, we don't know how durable and how complete the B cell depletion needs to be. But basically, it sounds like there's a competition to get there first from the leading players, just because of what we've seen in the CAR T cell space. It's getting the trial sites, it's getting established manufacturing, all of the challenges that those companies have faced. So I think the leading companies are trying to get out in front.
Excellent. Well, you can check out Lauren's story on biocentury.com. I'll drop a link in the show notes. And hey, let's head down under. Telix, KTT. They've got a NASDAQ listing now. They've got some diagnostic revenues, some clinical therapeutics. What's next for Telix?
Well, as Jeff, radiopharmaceuticals have been an area I've been watching closely for quite a while. And I did this really big analysis at the end of 2023. And when I was doing that and looking at every company and seeing who's kind of in what corner, specializing in what thing, there was Telix. And Telix was kind of doing a little bit of everything. And so I always sort of had this question, like, what's with Telix? And then I had the pleasure of finding out by speaking with their managing director and group CEO, Chris Behrenbruch, as well as the CEOs of their therapeutics and diagnostics units, which are separate. This is a restructuring that they did out in August, I think, ahead of their NASDAQ relisting and ultimately complete listing. So the real interesting thing about Telix is they are trying to be an end-to-end radiopharma company in kind of every sense of the word. So on the logistics front, and there's this really interesting quote where they talk about it's almost like being a logistics company first that does radiopharma, because as people know, the radiopharmaceuticals and radiodiagnostics, the fact that these are products that have this radioactive decay and are manufactured and have to be disposed of in very specific ways, it creates a tremendous logistical challenge to make these things work above and beyond your typical, manufacturing and distribution for pharmaceuticals. So they have acquired a lot of capabilities and also partnered. So they kind of have fingers in every pot in terms of things like radioisotope production, the distribution, radiopharmacy network, and just owning that all the way down to things like a radiopharmaceutical focused or radiodiagnostic focused sales force, and helping the radiologists with their camera setups and things like that for their diagnostic products. And then there's this element of wanting to own the continuum from the patient journey, all the way from first diagnosis to, hopefully a lasting treatment, but potentially also palliative care. And so their pipeline is structured in this way where they're kind of clustered around 4 main cancer tissue types. So prostate, kidney, brain, and bone, musculoskeletal. And then within that, they have both diagnostic and therapeutic products. And we've seen in this space companies say, we're an actinium-225 company, a lead-212 company, we're focused on lutetium, we're in this specific ligand modality, small molecules versus antibodies, et cetera. And they really do a mix of it all. They even have some more novel radioisotopes like astatine in the mix. And for them, it's less about having a specific type of platform around a specific type of technology than for sort of threading the needle around, for this indication, this stage of indication, what is the right modality and isotope for that? And then let's go do that. So in some cases, they say an antibody targeting will be better because of the hepatic clearance versus renal. And, you want an isotope that looks like this with this type of long path length, perhaps versus a shorter one. So in a landscape where a lot of companies are sort of staking their claim around a specific type of technology, Telix kind of stands out for saying we are willing to combine a large number of technologies to thread the needle for the right indication.
So, Karen, we've seen a lot of radiopharma takeouts over the past few years. Obviously, Novartis has kind of built up its radiopharma armamentarium, or whatever the kids say these days. Telix, are they a takeout target?
I think based on speaking with them, it seems like they are really trying to be a standalone company that does the radiopharmaceutical, radiodiagnostic, radiologistics end to end. I think they're more in the vein of trying to acquire than be acquired and stand up these capabilities. Of course, you can never say never, but it is interesting to see, what the long-term future of this will look like. But they're aiming to be that one big company that does radiopharmaceuticals across the spectrum. And is there an M&A journey for that? I don't know, but we'll find out.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for that, KTT. We'll definitely keep our eyes on Telix and, of course, on everything you're writing with Radiopharma. You did that. When was that big deep dive deck you did, the last one? That was pretty meaty and well worth a download, I would say.
Yes, it was end of 23, but I think people will still find it useful just as a starting map. There are a lot of grids and maps and things that kind of orient you in the space. So if you're starting to think about it, while yes, some of these programs have advanced and more players have come on the scene, I still think it's a useful sort of compass for anchoring oneself in the space.
All right. Well, Karen, Lauren, Steve, thanks as always. I'll get the links in the show notes to all of your stories. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, subscribe and check out our sister podcast, The BioCentury Show. That's also available in video format on our YouTube channel. Our next episode of the BioCentury Show, editor-in-chief and chief tennis correspondent Simone Fishburne will be in conversation with David Altschuler, the CSO of Vertex Pharmaceuticals. And Simone will be back next week to talk about English tennis wonderkind Jack Draper and how he fared at the BNP Paribas-backed Indian Wells tournament. Quick shout out to Kendall Square Orchestra. They provide the music for BioCentury this week. Next Sunday, March 23rd, the group will be taking the stage for its Light in Darkness event. It will be at the Sanders Theatre in Cambridge, Mass., and it will feature a violin concerto from Mendelssohn, among other things. So do check that out. Thanks for tuning in. We will catch you next week.